Hey everyone, welcome to a new type of format for mass transit. This is going to be called the carpool. Yeah, I know we're going to stick with the transportation theme, but that's how we do it here. And if it sounds corny and cheesy, we'll pick a new name next week because why not, right? In this format, which is going to take on the semblance of kind of like a fireside chat, but what does that have to do with mass transit? So we didn't use that name. I've got Dru Sellers with me. Dru, for those of you who know, those of you who might not know, Dru was the co-founder of Mass Transit. We started this thing back in 2007 when we met at Austin at the alt.net meeting there. And that kind of kicked off this whole adventure. So, Dru, say a little something about yourself.
Well, hello, everybody. Since originally meeting Chris and working on mass transit, I did take a step away from the project in terms of hands-on keyboard. But over all of those years, Chris and I have stayed in close contact and have definitely enjoyed spending time thinking about ways mass transit can be made better, or in some cases, passing along ideas to Chris as I would go and work in other organizations and with other tools. So nowadays, I'm working. I've just did 5 years of intense operational work for search engines, and I'm looking to bring that skill set and that knowledge back to the mass transit community and improve its operational story. And I'm even building my own product called MessageAid that will attempt to commercialize those services. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, awesome. So, one of the things that I think that's great about that is, mass transit, especially over the past few years, I focus, most of my time on a good and consistent developer experience across transports, whether it's RabbitMQ, Azure Service Bus, and now, we've added this, a couple years ago, but even stream-based systems like Kafka and Event Hub can use mass transit to process messages and use a consistent developer experience across those different types of message delivery solutions. And one of the things that I get hit on a lot, and in many cases I would just kind of go ask Dru, I was like, hey, how do you run these systems in production? And I've done it. We've built a lot of these systems that have been in production for 10 plus years. But there's always just kind of the common questions that pop up in the Discord. Things like, what do I do with my error queue? How do I deal with exceptions? How do I route messages out of that? And in many cases, we point people towards the tools that are built into the transport. Whether it's RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus Explorer. There's some mediocre solutions that at least let you get it done. But as you mentioned, Dru, MessageAid is going to be kind of a new operational tool to let people do that.
Exactly. Everything that you've probably built internally, now you'll have available right out of the box. So if you're going to a new company and you want all those tools kind of just ready for you, you can start off the get-go. Or if you're tired of maintaining those old tools with as versions upgrade or as new capabilities of mass transit might come out, again, now there's one spot where you can go and have all of that stuff caught up with.
Or as, one could say, when the person who wrote that utility that keeps our systems up and running at night left the company and now we don't know what it does.
That too.
Sort of like that ingrown message framework that was built by that one dude who said, "No, I could write my own. How hard could it be?" And then,
It can't be that
they
hard.
leave. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a common refrain is like, "Yeah, we have this thing that was built by this guy who used to work here."
He was a genius.
Yeah, he was brilliant, which is why he got another job. Speaking of jobs, that kind of takes us into another thing. Dru's obviously been up to a lot. For years, 24 years, I worked at McKesson, and as of November, I am now out on my own, and I am focusing on consulting and mass transit full time. And what does that mean for the community? I mean, I think since the pandemic, I started kind of really connecting with the end users through the YouTube channel. I started on Twitch and then went to YouTube and have really grown the community. And, just in terms of looking at like NuGet downloads, the activity on the Discord channel, Stack Overflow, GitHub discussions, all the avenues that people come to the community and me for support, it's really grown and it's really taken on an effort to where I feel like, maybe there's a business here. So, in starting my own company, Loosely Coupled LLC, I'm starting off, and now you can actually purchase commercial support agreements for mass transit. I provide support. There's full Zendesk ticketing and tracking. I provide architectural advisement, things like that. So I'm really taking this as kind of a full-time thing as to how, what is the commercial side of mass transit? How do we make that a business so that companies, and there are thousands of them, there's at least 1,000, probably two, who knows? It's hard to count when you don't actually require people to register the use of the software. So I can only go anecdotally by people that use it and ask questions and how much I keep track of. But, looking at the footprint that mass transit has, there's clearly a need to ensure kind of the continuity and sustainability of mass transit for these customers that have built on top of it. So looking to see how I can provide, and, talking with customers and having honest conversations about what does this look like? What does your company need to, have this up and running? So yeah, so that's a huge change. You don't work at a company for 24 years and then just suddenly up and start your own company. It was it took a lot of thinking about whether that was possible, and an opportunity came up, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It definitely is an adventure so far.
And it's been fun so far, right? Now, like this is you're still in your first 30 days? No, you're after your first 30 days
Yeah,
now,
I'm
right?
at like 6 weeks at this point, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I mean, the response, even without really advertising, the response has been huge. People have been like, "Oh, hey," and I've had a lot of, I do 2 hour kind of intake, architecture sessions over Zoom with companies, and it's been great to kind of. Let me just put it clearly. The thing I love the most about it is I'm getting to see how mass transit is being used by customers that aren't ones that I've worked with directly from the start. So it's really eye-opening to see how many different ways mass transit is being used to build out platforms, to build out applications, and just the industries it's in. I mean, I've always kind of worked in healthcare and then more recently distribution, supply chain. But like the crazy things people are building on top of mass transit is it it's it's pretty cool. And
It's
just
fun.
these, yeah, it's definitely rewarding. So yeah, there's been a goodness to that. So
Well, so for those, most people probably know that Chris is very active on Discord and monitors Twitter and Stack Overflow on topics of mass transit. And if you've used mass transit, you know it's a large, large framework. It covers a lot of different things. We recently got a question. I think this one came through Twitter, which asked the question, why would I use a Saga or a routing slip? So, Chris, first, tell me what a Saga and a routing slip are before we get into why you might choose one or the other.
yeah, that's some good stuff that came up, and it is a great question. It's like you have all these tools in the toolbox. Which one should I reach for and why? So mass transit has support for sagas, which there's a couple of different types, but the most common ones are the state machine based sagas. And it also has a feature called Courier, which is a routing slip implementation. And they they both do very similar things, but not really. So, and that's why the question
So,
comes up a lot.
and so what do you mean by that they're similar but not really?
Well, so both routing slip was built as an implementation of the original Saga paper. So there was a paper written out of Cornell back in the 80s about what is a Saga, and it's a way of doing a distributed transaction across decoupled services that supports execution and compensation of activities. So when you think about like a registration workflow of, the common one is like travel, like book the hotel, book the airline, book the car. Oh, there isn't a car available. Roll all that back. And it's like making notes along the way of what you've allocated, and if something fails, compensating or unallocating those resources that were part of that distributed transaction.
So
Um,
if we took out the fancy word distributed transaction, how might I write how like give me some other examples where I would run into this because I don't work for travel companies and the idea of trying to like orchestrate an air flight and enterprise rent a car and something else uh like that spans multiple companies in my mind. What might be an example inside of a singular company that you've seen before?
inside a singular company, yeah, that's kind of one of the decision criteria as well. When you're thinking about the two different capabilities. So let me kind of talk about the capabilities. So a saga is is what we typically refer to as like orchestration. It it's a stateful workflow that responds to events. So events being messages, whether it's an event or a command, it can actually do both. But as messages come into this state machine, the persistent state is used to ensure that only one event is processed at a time, and it allows those changes to occur. So let's say that within your company you have multiple services such as maybe billing, fulfillment, and order management that need to react or do something as part of like approving an order or processing a payment, something like that. And if those are part of your application, in a lot of cases, it makes sense to use a Saga, like a state machine, to say, oh, an order came in. I know that I always have to do these three things when an order comes in. I need to get payment authorization, I need to check fulfillment at the warehouse, and I need to update accounts receivable. Three things, they're always the same. And from a simplicity perspective, say you're just a small team and you're working within a single, solution, a Saga makes perfect sense because you control all those resources. You know that you're allocating those three things, and if any of those fail, you can deal with those individually. But it's all part of just managing that workflow of getting an order paid and fulfilled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that sounds so that's a Saga. So how does that feel with a routing slip?
Okay, so a routing slip with a Saga, the state is stored within some sort of repository database, and that's a central point of control. It's orchestration. With a routing slip, the actual state of that transaction is in the routing slip itself, and that state is passed across the activities in the routing slip. So there is no central controller. It's what's typically referred to as choreography, if you're looking for like a word to Google and understand. And why I would use a routing slip, it gives me two really nice things. Activities along the routing slip are solely responsible for understanding how they are part of that routing slip in terms of execution, knowing if they have to compensate, and then storing that compensation information so that if the routing slip fails further down the road, as the compensation comes back to that activity, it knows how to put that back. So if I was in a large company and I'm communicating with a lot of external services, it makes total sense that I would use a routing slip because I don't know, I don't own the accounting system, but I know that I've got to get, pay, or I don't know the credit card authorization system, but I know it's external, it's an HTTP call. It may or may not fail, but I need to get an authorization from it, so I might do that as the first activity in the routing slip. At that point, once I have that credit card information, I may store that into the accounts payable system as part of another activity in the routing slip. And then I may go to the fulfillment system and say, okay, I need to fulfill this because it's been billed, it's been tracked in the accounting system. Now I need to go ahead and fulfill that order. Maybe I'm going to do that separately. And if that fulfillment is there and it's not there, we may roll those payments back. And I may want to change the order of that. I may want to try to fulfill it first and then build a credit card, or build a credit card, fulfill it, and then hit accounting. It's that dynamic and flux, that nature of flux, that the flexibility to be able to roll those out across different services that we probably don't control, and we're just trying to bring them together.
So did I hear you right in saying that you can change the steps in a routing slip?
Yeah, so routing slips, one of the nice things is they are composed of an itinerary of discrete activities. And any activity in a routing slip can actually change or revise the itinerary to add new activities. It can add them at the front, and it can add them at the rear. It can copy the original ones. It can exit the entire thing entirely and just say, boom, done. We can't do this. This is not processable. It violated a business rule. It needed to fail now. And that's one of the nice things about routing slips is if I had a Saga and that Saga called another system and that other system said, hey, I need you to also do these two other things, there is no way for a Saga to do that. It isn't going to be able to have that knowledge. But if it's a routing slip activity, it can say, oh, well, I need to do this, and I also want to tag another activity onto the end of the routing slip so that I can either make good or, add a final reconciliation or do some sort of additional step once I know that the routing slip is going to succeed successfully. Sometimes it's producing an event. Sometimes it's just updating a journal entry to say, yeah, commit this. This is good.
So let's make that a little more concrete. Like, what's an example of wanting to change an itinerary? Like, give me an example itinerary that you've seen in the past with concrete steps, and then like where you've had to add a step at the front or the back or whatever.
Okay, here's what I consider to be a really good example, because especially when we're building distributed systems, everybody wants it fast. We all think we got to be web scale, so we've got to be super quick. In one of the systems that we built, when requests would come into the application and we would process those inbound messages, they would have like an identifier of a customer.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not necessarily a customer, but it would say, okay, here's my customer identifier. Well, let's say we didn't find that identifier. If one of our activities was a customer lookup, if it didn't find the identifier, it would fail the rest of the processing. Well, in this particular application, not having that identifier wasn't acceptable. We need to be able to say, because we're never going to get this data again. There was no way to go back to the source system and say, hey, could you spell your name again? Did you write this down properly? That wasn't something we could do. So what we had to do was take the other information in that message and call out to a remote system to look up based on the demographic data like birth date, zip code, things like that, and see if we could actually figure out who they were with a reasonable enough degree of certainty that we could then know that real customer identifier or add a new mapping of a new identifier. But that is a significantly slower operation.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, routing slips have an itinerary and the activities execute in order. Each activity is going to, it's a queue. Every activity sits on a queue, and so messages are going to be sitting in that queue. That activity, by looking up by identifier, is really fast. It's sub-millisecond. It looks it up, adds it to the routing slip, and calls the next activity. That's its whole purpose in life. But if it couldn't find that identifier, it needs to do that whole demographic-based lookup. That's expensive. That's seconds, because we're calling to an external API. We didn't want to bottleneck the execution of the routing slip by having every message wait because I had to go do an external lookup. So what we did is we revised the itinerary. We assert an additional activity immediately to be the next activity to actually do the demographic lookup and have the same output in the routing slip that the identity one would do. And the reason that added so much value is any of these slower transactions that weren't immediately identified and passed on were pushed off to another activity, which is on a separate queue that all of the ones that had proper identifiers never saw. So it made it so that our normal processing path for these transactions was super quick, and only the ones that were exceptions because they didn't have a proper identifier went off to that other activity that had a slower processing and then slipped back into the mainstream and executed with everything else.
So conceptually, there was find customer by this identifier and then go do some work. And
Yes.
if you couldn't find them by that identifier, you could insert another activity that would go find and effectively populate that data for you. And then it would go on to whatever the do work steps ended up being.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So you said earlier that routing slips, there's no central database, like it's choreography. And I think that's a great word because I imagine like multiple people, like dancing, choreography and dance, they all have to interpret each other in real time versus coordination. There's a coordinator, which, in this case, maybe I think of it as the database because it's the central lock. So in the routing slip world, how do I know how my routing slip's doing?
That's a good point, and it's asked a lot, and it sometimes is a decision maker on which approach you take. Routing slips produce events as they execute, and those events can be routed to, something that keeps track of the current state. There's a couple of ways. If you really need the dynamic nature of a routing slip and it absolutely just makes sense, you need the compensation and everything, You can use modern tools like OpenTelemetry to like query for the tags, find the results, and see the graph of where it's at. Now that isn't really actually hitting a state. That's requiring a bunch of other tools and operational infrastructure to make stuff work. Whereas with a Saga, it's in a database somewhere. If you know the order number or whatever, you can actually just go query the database and say, hey, do I have this? What's its last known state? What am I waiting for? When was the last update? All of that is readily available, and I have samples, all over the place that do that a lot because I want to be able to query that state. In fact, I even recommended the examples using a message to query the state from the Saga directly, because then you're getting an actual response versus looking at a raw table and not necessarily, and it creates a coupling too versus just doing a request client query to the Saga state. With a routing slip, that state is on the wire. So what I typically see in every production app I've built using routing slips, there is an associated Saga that keeps track of the overall state of the transaction. Typically just started and completed or faulted, because it doesn't know how it's going along the way. And they're generally completed within a few seconds, so the state doesn't really change a lot through the time. You're going to call these external APIs. If you have 5 activities, each one takes a second, that's a 5-second operation from start to finish. Did it pass or did it fail? So typically you'll see them in conjunction.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need to be able to if let's say it's something that takes 30, 40 minutes and you need to constantly be able to check that state, that's where having, it orchestrated by a Saga might make more sense.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that's hopefully helpful to everybody on the variety of things of Saga and routing slip. But Chris, if you're going to kind of like high level it for us, right? We've just been going on for quite a while. Like wrap it up, high level it for us.
High
Saga
level,
versus
high,
routing slip.
high level, small team, you're within a single domain, you want to be able to check state, things like that. Sagas are super easy to get started with. Routing slips are definitely next level complexity. I mean, Sagas are at like that 200 level. Routing slips are probably 300, 400 level. If you need the dynamic nature and need to be able to, redefine the itinerary at runtime, routing slips are super powerful. They really can do a lot of things for you. If you want to have it to where there's no knowledge in the Saga of what the activities do in terms of dependencies, and you have multiple teams, routing slip might make more sense. And if you're calling a lot of external services and there's a dependency on downstream calls, of other things, rather than dealing with all of that coordination, it might make sense to use a routing slip.
Right on.
All
Well,
right.
anything else, Chris? Otherwise, I feel like this is a good first carpool.
I think so too. I think we've covered a lot, and yeah, I think it's a great way to bring some of this abstract content that's more architectural or conversational in nature, that isn't tied to like a specific feature or technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been great to kick this off. Give us some feedback, leave a few comments, ask questions, whatever. You're always, welcome to like this or hate it. Either one, just let us know. And if there's subjects or, ideas that you'd like discussed in a future carpool, post a comment below and we'll see what we can do. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.